Hey guys, today is Monday, March 3rd. I know you guys were all expecting a snow day, so was I. But we were here, and today what we did was, first of all, I gave everyone Geography 19, which will be due on Thursday. It's been emailed to you, and it will be on the homework calendar every day this week. Then what we decided to do was go over all of the infographics that we looked at on Thursday when we were in the library. We kind of are going to move in and out of this educational Millennium Development Goal pretty quickly, and I think that these infographics do a really great job of explaining the state of education, the obstacles to getting an education, and the progress that we've made towards meeting this goal. So that said, I think we'll just talk about these infographics because they kind of cover everything pretty well. The first one that we looked at was this one called the ripple effect. I love the look of this little infographic. We talked about how, first of all, sorry, let me go scoop back up there. 1 out of 5 girls in the developing world don't complete 6th grade. I mean, think about it, you're in 7th grade. That's a startling number that 1 in 5 don't even make it to 6th. Then we talked about how just by going for 1 extra year of schooling, a woman can make 10 to 20% more than had she not received that 1 year of schooling. So then we made a connection to HIV and AIDS. Now this will make that connection to another Millennium Development Goal, the one about preventable diseases. We discussed that if a woman, or really anyone, is educated, the rates of AIDS are reduced by, or HIV and AIDS I should say, are reduced by 50%, and almost 700,000 cases can be prevented each year. So why is that? Simply, I mean, I think it's things that we take for granted. I mean, I'm not going to get into 8th grade health class, but you take a health class that teaches you to make smart decisions. And we know that drugs are bad. One way that HIV and AIDS was spread for some time was drugs that were taken through needles, like heroin and dirty needles and sharing needles, things like that. Poor medical facilities. But we're educated here. We can make smart decisions about those types of things. So that's, again, that ripple effect that this infographic refers to. All right, then how can education help the family? Basically, in developing countries, what we see are a lot of young girls getting married too young, and their role is to grow the family and to take care of things in the home. So if they instead get an education, then they're learning something, they're building their knowledge, they're possibly putting themselves on career tracks, they're making smarter decisions about their family planning. What that means is getting married 4 years earlier. If someone gets 7 years of education, they tend to get married 4 years later. So that's a good thing. A woman is more mature, can maybe marry someone that she really loves, not just marry someone that her culture expects her to marry. She might have a job bringing in an income for her family. And speaking of family, she'll have 2 fewer children. We're going to talk about this in the 4th marking period when we talk about population. But there's something known as the replacement growth, I think it's called the replacement growth theory. And basically what that means is, for every 2 people, the 2 parents, we should have 2 children. We have a population problem. We're growing too fast. And these women who don't get educated about family planning, or who don't have careers or things like that, they tend to have too many children. That sounds terrible coming out, but really it is a problem, not just for that family that can't necessarily afford all of those children, but for their society and for the planet. So education can help that. All right, so let's move on to the next one. I really love the look of this second infographic. Oh, where is it? We're stalling. Here we go. Literacy. And a lot of you didn't know what illiteracy meant last week. That basically means, I should say, literacy is the ability to read and write. So illiteracy is the inability to read or write. That said, we talked about how 16% of our population is illiterate. That totals about 775 million people, most of them in India, which we discussed that kind of makes sense because India has such a huge population, but it's still unfortunate that a country that does value education, that they should have so many people who are illiterate. So we talked about how illiteracy does affect women, again, because it could affect how much they know about decisions that regard their health and their childbearing, whether or not they're going to vaccinate their children, different things like that. We discussed the link between poverty and education, that somebody who doesn't get an education is more likely to end up in an impoverished life. Similarly, somebody who lives in poverty is more likely to not receive an education or, complete their primary school education. So there's that poverty cycle again. Something else we discussed is how literacy really has an impact on the success of a democracy. We talked about countries like Afghanistan, for example, where they're finally putting in place a democracy, which is a human right to have elections and a democratic form of government where the people can get involved and have a voice. But if the people are illiterate, then they have trouble reading about the democratic process, finding out about their candidates, learning where the polling stations are, finding out how to register for a voter ID or whatever they might need. So when you have all of these barriers and obstacles, it's easier to throw your hands up in the air and say, I'm not going to vote. And that's when democracy falls apart, when people aren't a part of it, when people don't participate in their government. So if people are illiterate, that democratic process is more likely to fall apart. Also, they have a harder time exercising their civil rights. If you think back to that Malala video that we watched last week, the children that couldn't read or write, they signed their name to contracts with their thumbprint. Now, there was something very sweet about that, but at the same time, think about the bigger picture here. If people can't read the contracts that they're putting their thumbprint on, they don't know what they're signing and agreeing to. They don't know that they're not being deceived. So we see civil rights being violated many times when there's a high rate of illiteracy. Now, this topic here caused quite a bit of discussion. It says that living in a conflict-affected area increases the likelihood of not becoming literate or not gaining access to education. I was startled by this number, that 21 developing countries spend more on arms than on primary schools. And some kids in the class made the argument that in conflict-affected areas, you need guns for protection more than a book. And I understand that immediate reaction, but my argument back to that, and you don't have to agree with me, but my argument back is when we invest in arms and in weapons, then what we're doing is plotting a future that involves arms and weapons. So we plot a future of violence. If we invest in money and books, or at least split the money somehow, I'm not saying that we shouldn't put money into our military. I'm certainly not saying that by any means. But if we do put some money into education, then what we're doing is creating an educated youth. And that generation will grow up and they'll make decisions for that country or that place. And hopefully they will create a better future for that place that doesn't have to rely so much on arms. So maybe that's the dreamer in me, but I think it makes sense. All right, so moving forward, let's see. And actually, I find this funny. One of the students in third period showed me, I didn't realize this before, but this picture shows the path of one person. I thought it was just a whole bunch of people in this village, but here she is as a baby, crawling, walking, going to school, secondary school, graduating, and then having a family of her own. So when we look at it this way, what we're looking at now is not just how education affects the woman or the individual woman, but how it affects her as a mother and therefore how it affects her children. So we talked about how if a woman is educated, she's more likely to want to see that same education given to her child. Also, she might be able to get a job, and with that money, she can help provide a better life for her child. With that education, she will know more about proper nutrition and proper health, and it says here 50% of educated mothers are 50% more likely to immunize their children. Now what that means is when we're born, we get these vaccinations, like polio, for example. Polio at one time was a big problem. So we realized that if we inject a little bit of dead polio into people, that their body will fight that and then become immune to it. So while there is a movement now that's sort of anti-vaccines and anti-immunizations, and we'll save that discussion for another day, Still, in these developing countries, immunizations save lives, and that's part of what helps children live to the age of 5, which was another statistic up here, that a child born to an educated mother is more than 2 times as likely to survive to age 5. That's a wonderful thing. So again, you see that ripple effect of education. So just scrolling through, a lot of good data here, and 1 in 4 women around the world can't even read this sentence, meaning 1 in 4 women, or 25% of women, are illiterate. Further, 53% of the children out of school are girls. Now, a lot of guys did ask, why aren't we talking more about boys? And that is a valid point, but when it comes down to it, this really does link up with women's empowerment. All right, so I love this infographic. I love the look of it. I love the data. Look at the pie chart and the glasses. The colors work. The data is great. But what I really like is it's finally one that talks about some progress. So if we come down here, we see Ethiopia over here on the left. Ethiopia is a country with poverty, hunger, violence. It's really a sad state of affairs in Ethiopia. But if you look, in 2000, they had 34% of their girls enrolled in school, and in 10 years, it just jumped up to 84%. Now, I don't know a lot about Ethiopia, but I interpret that as saying, that says a lot about their government and how much the people buy into their government programs, which to me would be a good thing. Again, I might be reading that wrong, but that looks like a big success story to me. All right, so you look at India. India raised, or I should say lowered, their student-to-teacher ratio from 43 students to 1 teacher to 31 students to 1 teacher, which I think we could all agree less students to 1 teacher is better for everyone. In Bangladesh, almost 6 million girls are receiving a secondary education now. Now remember, the MDG 2 for education says that all students will complete a primary school education. That's your basic stuff. But Bangladesh, they're moving girls into secondary, which is great. You look at a place like Haiti, which is coming out of an earthquake. Their agriculture is destroyed. They had a recent outbreak of cholera, poverty, hunger, but they managed to educate 772,000 children. That's a success story. That's wonderful. All right, so moving on, last one. The last piece of this puzzle is that we've been talking about children not being able to get an education, what's stopping them from getting to school, why don't places provide education, stories like Malala. But what about the kids that do go to school, that are sitting in a classroom, but yet they're still not receiving a good education? What's happening there? And unfortunately, that's a problem in many places. We see here that 28.8 million teachers are working in classrooms around the world, but less than half of them have the minimum training that's really required. You see, we talked about, where was it last week? I guess in Mali, the village wanted a teacher, so they persuaded the government to find them a teacher. That doesn't mean that there's a number of qualified applicants applying for the job. That means they're taking somebody who's literate, who can read and write. Maybe in that case that was a real trained teacher, but in some cases you find someone who can read and write, and then they teach the kids to read and write. So while that's valuable, they're not a qualified teacher. Here you can see how many trained teachers are in primary schools in different countries. Here's Ethiopia again. 48% of the teachers are actually trained. Down here it tells us that we would need almost 7 million teachers to reach this goal, 1 million in Africa alone. Now scrolling down, 40 students per teacher is what's ideal, a maximum of 40 students. We're lucky. I think the most I have in a class is 29, and that's a lot. It's really hard to meet the needs of everybody in a class of 29. I think we do our best, and I think we do a pretty good job, but sometimes I feel like I don't reach everybody. So imagine a class like in Central African Republic where there's 81 students to 1 teacher. That's awful. And then you see Sweden, 9 students to 1 teacher. Now Sweden, Finland, those are some of the best countries in the world in terms of education. And their class size, I think, is a good reflection of that. All right, and then we see some more improvement. Cambodia, Timor, Senegal, they've all lowered their student-to-teacher ratios. And you see countries like Benin in Africa, Cambodia, and Yemen, they're actually increasing their teacher training. And they say that it's because of this global partnership for education. That's our 8th millennium development goal, which is to build those global partnerships. So that's a perfect example of how that's working. So that was what we discussed today. I also just wanted to let you know that towards the end of the marking period, you're going to be working on a project in PictoChart. You're going to be creating your own infographic, which I've vaguely mentioned in the past. But what I want you to start thinking about now is, what MDG do you want to focus on, or which MDGs do you want to focus on? You can do one, or you can do a few that relate. Arguably, they all relate, but maybe you want to focus on two and really define their relationship. Or maybe you want to do all 8 and just show very briefly like how much progress we've made in each goal or lack of progress. That's up to you. But what I want you to understand is that you're not going to have to go out there searching for data and information. I'm giving you all of this data and information. And certainly you can go out and find more, but by doing these weekly infographic activities, you're being given data through infographics, and I want you to make notes on those sheets that I'm giving you, the worksheets. If you see an infographic that you really like, either because of the way they present the data or the numbers that they use, that's fine. Circle it, highlight it, make a note, use a Post-it, so that when we do sit down in a few weeks to create our infographics, you can actually refer back to the one that I gave you, and you could say, oh yeah, that's right, I wanted to use this infographic and this one from this MDG and this other one because I liked the map that they used. And you can borrow all of that information as long as you cite your sources on the bottom. So start being cognizant of that now. Every time we have class and we look at infographics, make sure that you're making note of all the things that you're going to want to do for your own infographic. All right, I think that's it. So if you have any questions, email me. Geography is on the calendar, and I will see you tomorrow. Bye.